All right, my friends. Today we're talking about The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, a German work from 1924 called Der Zauberberg. As you remember, I mentioned a clever young adult novel by Diane Wynne Jones, writer of Howl's Moving Castle, later adapted by Hayao Miyazaki, where she includes a book among Howl's library called Der Zauberbuch, which is a clever allusion to Der Zauberberg. Der Zauberbuch, of course, meaning the magic book, as opposed to the magic mountain. And so one of the questions that we'll investigate during the course of these lectures, as well as you write your final essays, is what is magical about this mountain? Like so many modernist texts, this is a text that indulges in realism. It is not a fantastical book. These individuals have jobs, they have normal scopes of lives, they do not possess, say, wands like Harry Potter, nor do they have some relationship to the gods like in epic literature, like Aeneas, who is himself the son of Aphrodite, or Venus, the goddess of love, or Achilles, who is the son of Thetis, goddess of the silver feet, as it were. These characters are very much humans who were born to humans, who live sort of bourgeois, normal lives like humans, and yet the claim of the title is that there is some magic in this text. Perhaps it is a localized magic, perhaps it is only the mountain itself on which the International Sanatorium Berghof is located in the mountains, the very tall mountains of Switzerland, the very tall and remote mountains of Switzerland. As I said during seminar on Monday, one might take the mental image as an American, particularly on the Gulf Coast, of, say, The Shining or of the Grand Budapest Hotel, as looking something like what the Berghof would look like if one needs a mental image to be supplied, because one comes from a place that has very rarely known snow and certainly does not know mountains, as it were. In any case, here is a picture of Thomas Mann and his wife Katja Mann in the Pacific Palisades in 1941. Keep in mind, 1941. You recall that the Great War, World War I, occurred over 1914 and 1918. You also know that America's, the United States' involvement in World War II was 1941 to 1945. However, World War II really began in Europe in 1939. Thomas Mann, I said, where did he come from? He speaks and writes in German. He is a German. And so we know that Germany was the great enemy in World War I, one of them, as well as in World War II as well. Well worth looking into those dynamics. And in fact, two of their allies in World War I, so-called Triple Alliance, disappeared. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Turkish, or excuse me, the Ottoman Turkish Empire. There is, of course, still a Turkey that exists, but the Ottoman Turks no longer exist as a major power. That said, 1941, he's in the Pacific Palisades. Pacific Palisades, I don't think Germany neighbors on the Pacific Ocean at all. He had moved out west, not only west to America, but out to my native California to flee from National Socialism. Something that I'll mention in the third or fourth slide on this, about this particular author, is that though Thomas Mann was a German, he's very much a German, but though critical of his own people, he, unlike many German intellectuals at his time, including very famously the philosopher still very much in vogue named Martin Heidegger, was anti-Nazi. Martin Heidegger famously, like many German intellectuals and scientists, joined the Nazi Party and even spoke on their behalf at university convocations at times, at least one that I know of. Thomas Mann was always an ardent opponent of Nazism and National Socialism. National Socialism is what Nazi is short for, by the way. So you should know that. And so one reason that Thomas Mann is perhaps not as large an international figure in the literary space, and perhaps not as big as, say, G.W.F. Goethe, his own countryman, though technically from the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the 18th century, is because there's a certain feeling of shame that is associated with Thomas Mann. The claim of many German individuals as the Nazis fell and left power was that A, there was nothing that they could do, but B, that they didn't really know everything that was going on. You know, the internet wasn't there, and the media didn't have access to the same sorts of sort of information that we can immediately have access to when we say we look at various conflicts around the globe. If you want to know what's going on in Gaza, there are lots of images and videos that you can immediately access. If you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, you can do the same thing. You don't even need to use Western outlets. There are plenty of Middle Eastern news sources as well as Eastern news sources. Though, one always has to worry about what is being portrayed by particular outlets given their priors, as it were. That said, this man was, at least so far as we have conceptualized history, was on the right side of history. And partially because he was on the right side of history, he became cosmopolitan and was himself self-exiled from his own home, and also has not been studied to the extent that perhaps his literary value suggests, because he causes a sense of shame in his own countrymen because of his own moral sort of righteousness, as it were. All right, just a couple things about more. Thomas Mann's time and brief summary of his life. Thomas Mann was born in 1875 and died in 1955. He achieved fame with his very first novel. So he, like Goethe, was famous the vast majority of his literary professional life. This work, Budenbrooks, 1901. Notice that that's 23 years before The Magic Mountain, much less time to develop as an author, which recounts the story of the physical decline of a once vigorous merchant family as it turns from business to the arts. Very apropos, I would say. With so many families that are successful in business and have a next generation that has either athletics or the arts emphasized so well. In any case, Mann's other major works include the short story A Death in Venice, which is a fascinating work, and I highly recommend that you read. This is very modernist and very strange and very much like something you might read in Vladimir Nabokov's work. He, of course, is the author of Lolita, that work of a middle-aged seducer of a young lady. Well, Death in Venice is the lusting of the writer Gustav von Aschenbach, who falls in love with a young boy named Tazio, and decides to die plague in a doomed city with him. Death in Venice. He's taking a visit to this Venetian city, and as he's on visit, very White Lotus-esque at his resort, he notices a family, mom, a daughter, and this very beautiful young boy. And this author, Aschenbach, is smitten with this young boy. And even though he discovers that there is a plague that is running through Venice, virulent, and will certainly kill those with whom it comes into contact, he chooses, because of his great lust for this boy, to stay in Venice and thus dies. Something I should say about Thomas Mann's own personal life is though he had several children, including one who very sadly committed suicide. There were many suicides in Thomas Mann's life. I think I have a slide on the various family members of his that did commit suicide. But even though Thomas Mann obviously had a wife and had multiple children, he's known to have been homosexual himself, which comes through in his writing. Not only in A Death in Venice does one have an older man have a lust for a younger man, you'll see that in The Magic Mountain itself, that the love interest of Hans Castorp, named Madame Shosha, is his love interest precisely because she reminds him of a young boy, Pribislav Shipa, or Hippa, excuse me, Shivaslav Hippa, who himself had, in his own words, an Asiatic look to himself, and who once lent him and this is a very symbolic object to lend somebody, particularly male to male, lent him his pencil. Pencil not only because of its shape, reminding us of the phallus, but also because of its generative capacity, right? A pencil is used to create. You make something new from it, right? Or you draw in the same way that a phallus is used as partial generation of a new human. So to share a pencil between two individuals is very suggestive, not to mention the fact that the new science of psychoanalysis, which becomes a branch of psychology, still studied today, was very much in vogue at this time. The early 20th century is when Sigmund Freud was really in his heyday, as well as Carl Jung, as well as Alfred Adler, as well, these three branches of psychoanalysis. Eros-based psychology, lust-based, Freud, the joy principle as it were, Adler, the power principle, his last name in fact means eagle, and then Jung, the principle of metempsychosis or transmigration. Jung itself means young, as his name. In any case, The Magic Mountain was written in 1924, so 2 years after Ulysses in the wake of World War I and during Weimar Germany. That is, of course, the Germany that existed between the German Empire, and it lasted until 1918. And of course, the coming of National Socialism, very famously 1933 or so, when I think Hitler took total power, was voted in. All right. He then writes a tetralogy, that's a work of 4 works on Joseph and his brothers from 1933 to 43, and a very, 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 very strange work called Dr. Faustus. You see again, Faust. You recall that Faust itself is a nom de plume that means luck. To be Faustus is to be lucky or happy. But this is obviously a reference itself to the Faust that we read. The strange story of it, let me see if I just put it here, is that there's a deal with the devil. But what is the deal with the devil here? Faust, there's an actual deal between Faust and Mephistopheles, the devil figure modeled off of the devil from, or excuse me, the accuser from the book of Job in the Jewish Bible. But here, the deal with the devil is allegorized, recall that means symbolized from our topic on Monday, by a conscious infecting with syphilis, that's the STI, syphilis, in order to add to the protagonist's genius prior to his mental collapse. Very famously, there was a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a nurse during the Prussian War in the middle of the 19th century. And during that time, we speculate as scholars that he lay with a prostitute who was syphilitic and that he acquired syphilis. Why do we think this? About 16, 17, 18 years later, when he's 38 or 39, Nietzsche, after a time of tremendous intellectual output, if you look at his collected works and notebooks, the guy spent all day writing, basically every day of his adult life. And there are some like that. But then he went crazy. And for the last 10 years or so of his life, his sister took care of him, edited his works. So there are ongoing debates about how much of his work is actually his work, how much of his work is his sister's work. She was far more of a Nazi-leaning sort of individual. So people sometimes wonder to what extent Nietzsche's ideas of self-German are actually connected to the then ensuing Nazism that came after him, or to what extent his sister must have doctored his works in order to make them seem more like that. And that's one of the difficult questions that Nietzsche scholars have to deal with. In any case, the nature of his illness was very similar to what folk ideas of syphilis did. Did you ever seen images of people with syphilis? What about this? If you were ever to suspect that anybody that you knew or even hated had it, I would highly you would be very good to recommend that they get checked out and cured, because syphilis not only drives you crazy after a long dormant period, but it starts to rot your face away. And you can see images of this. It's horrifying what syphilis does to people. So in the same way that tuberculosis was huge in the early 20th century, and also Spanish flu broke out in 1918 as well, very much a plague. There are terrifying STIs like syphilis around. And so we think, or at least one of the hypotheses about what happened to Friedrich Nietzsche is he caught syphilis, had a moment of tremendous intellectual excitement, followed by a degeneration into a defective syphilitic state where he was effectively no longer himself for the remaining years of his life. He lost his mind. After being a philosopher, you should think about that. Like, generally, the course of life for a philosopher is to gain wisdom in a somewhat linear way until around 70, drop that wisdom in some articulated fashion, and then basically die after one's mind starts to decline. That is not the way of life that Nietzsche had. That said, this work, Dr. Faustus, this author, the protagonist of it, seems to want to live a Nietzschean life in order to be a profound genius, a literary genius. And you may want to really think about this sort of sacrifice. Not that you want to make it yourself, but to understand the nature of it. He consciously chooses, in order to be a great writer, to take on syphilis, to suffer its degenerative and negative effects. So that he can be a brilliant writer for someone. I can even imagine making such a choice as that, to consciously infect yourself with a disease that will certainly drive you crazy, may eat your face away, just so that you can be successful for 10 years, 15 years. Is that the sort of thing that you would be willing to do? I mean, you might think that that's a crazy question, but I might say, well, what about some professional athletes who have to risk CTE in order to make millions of dollars? They may themselves derive a degenerative condition from the nature of their work that then leads them to losing their impulse control, and possibly even their families. This is a very sad eventuality that happens to some athletes, but there are very much professions that continue to exist where these sorts of sacrifices are considered by the wise, as it were. In any case, Dr. Faust is a very strange work, and so you're getting some inclination into the strange mind of Thomas Mann from Death in Venice, Dr. Faustus, and of course the work that we are now reading now, Set Image of Tuberculosis Sanatorium. I should also mention, though it's going to sound sort of minor, given how much was achieved by Thomas Mann, that he in fact won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1929. He would later leave Germany in 1933 after the Nazi seizure of power. He first lived in Switzerland and then moved to the United States in 1939. That's where we saw him in the Pacific Palisades, out west in California. Mann was a member of the League of Nations Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. You will recall that the League of Nations was the international organization that preceded the United Nations, as it were, though it was not powerful enough to do that which it aimed to do. Whether the United Nations will be powerful enough to ensure world peace is itself an open question at this particular moment, and whether any international organization can ever have the teeth necessary to exercise power over sovereign nations is itself an open question. Many people did start to believe that after World War II, and with the coming of the Soviets and the bipolar era between the United States and the Soviets. But whether, in fact, such international organizations will continue to be effective is a question that many people are asking. This Committee on Intellectual Cooperation was established in 1922 for the purpose of building up international relations among teachers, artists, scientists, and members of other intellectual professions, and improving the working conditions of the educated workforce. You might imagine that to some extent they were successful, to others not. Its members included preeminent scientists like Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, and the composer Bela Bartok. In 1926, the committee moved from Geneva to Paris, that's from Switzerland to France, where it was reestablished as the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, IIIC, as it were. Let's talk about the Magic Mountain itself. It was published in Weimar Germany before World War II and after World War I in 1924, 2 years prior to James Joyce's Ulysses, 2 years posterior to James Joyce's Ulysses, and 1 year prior to Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. It takes place over 7 years, from 1907 to 1914. You will note 7 symbolism over and over again. 7 years is how long this book takes. Settembrini, the great humanist figure, his name comes from Sept, like September, which is 7th month. You'll notice that our numbers are off. Our 7th month is actually our 9th month. Our 8th month, October, is actually our 10th month. Our 9th month, November, is actually our 11th month, and our 10th month is actually our 12th month, December, as it were. And so the interesting thing to note. Also sevens, Hans Castorp, his last name obviously has 7 letters in it, as well as he stays in a room that is room 3 plus 4. He is supposed to stay originally in the sanatorium as a guest, just seeing his poor tuberculosis-ridden cousin, Joachim Siemsen, for 3 weeks. That's 7 times 3. And also, he at the dining hall where the denizens of the tuberculosis sanatorium eat, there are 7 tables, all of which Hans Castorp will eat at some point, though he was only originally supposed to stay at this place for 3 weeks. In any case, this work takes place over 7 years, from 1907 to 1914, which is, of course, the beginning of World War I, 1914. And it ends on a battlefield in Flanders, Belgium, on a battlefield. In fact, Hans Castorp will be the individual we follow onto the battlefield, where he will be taking on machine gun and mortar fire when we leave. We don't know what happens, though. We may have some strong hypotheses regarding it. In any case, from 1914 to 1918, Flanders Fields was a major battle theater on the Western Front. We call places where great battles are ongoing, theaters of combat. So in, say, World War II, you'll often hear a notion about the European theater, about the Pacific theater. And so that's where the spectacle of war happens. And you can see that there is an element of spectacle in war. You may have heard that during the American Civil War, early on during it, people thought it would only last 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days, and it lasted 4 years. Typical of people entering wars. Even the wars ongoing now, people thought it would last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 days, and both have been going on for several, multiple years now. In any case, during the American Civil War, there were families that would come and watch battles on hills just to see what was happening there. It was considered a fun thing to do, and you might say that's really macabre, but I'd say you do obviously know that public executions have been a major part of every civilization that's ever existed, and certainly still existed during the 19th century. And you can still, this may have been changed in the last 5 or 10 years, but at least until 2000, you could still hang a man in Texas as a way of executing one. And so, in any case, public executions, looking at war, gruesome things, these are spectacles that humans wish to ingest, like to ingest. In any case, just to give a little bit of scope, you hear during your history education war, there was the Peloponnese War, there was the Persian War, the war between the Carthaginians, there's the Punic Wars between the Carthaginians and the Romans. You hear war. Really, you haven't heard what you need to hear until you hear the scope of wars. How many people died during the course of these wars? And the scope magnified during World War I. All of a sudden, we have these things called planes that we can send into the sky to drop bombs on people, to shoot each other down. We have these terrible poisonous gases, and we have these awesome rockets that we can shoot each other, as well as machine guns come about for the first time. You really want a good idea of just how devastating machine guns are. There's a little anachronistic. You should watch the opening scene to Saving Private Ryan. That's D-Day, the D-Day, and has the great assault on the shore that the American troops attempted in U-boats or in small craft, and they just get torn apart by German machine guns, literally torn apart by these 50 caliber bullets, which are large bullets shot at very, very, very fast speeds. They literally tear humans apart. And so these weapons, better developed in World War II than in World War I, out of World War I, actually used a version from the French called a Shosha, same name as Madame Shosha. And so because of the development of technology and the amount of people involved in World War I, it was a world war. The devastation was many times greater than it had ever been in the history of any war. And so, 1 million soldiers from more than 50 different countries were wounded, missing, or killed in action here. Entire cities and villages were destroyed. Keep in mind, you can drop bombs on these cities, and their population scattered across Europe and beyond. If you travel to Europe and particular places that were involved in World War I and World War II, you can still see where, say, I've been to places in Germany like Mainz, as well as Munich. There are still bullet holes in many of the buildings in Munich. And in Mainz, you can see where Americans dropped rockets in the middle of their town square, because there will be Mainz is itself a Roman city that then was very big in the Middle Ages. You can see all these sort of old buildings, and then right in the middle of them, a brand new one that was built, in the last 50 or 60 years. The evidence of the catastrophe of these wars is very much still present as physical scars on the landscape of Europe. And I would say very worth your while to see, particularly as we ourselves head towards a time that many predict is more of a darker time. It might be good to see the ravages of war, how they still have, and the effect that they continue to have on peoples and places. In any case, this work was originally conceived as a comic companion to A Death in Venice, as you can tell, you know, a writer choosing to accept plague in order to follow his lust for a young boy. Sort of a tragic tale, not the most humorous tale, and this was supposed to be a little bit more lighthearted. And I think you can get a touch of that lightheartedness, particularly in the first 4 of 7 chapters in this text that take place over the course of 3 weeks. That's another interesting thing to think about the nature of the novel and time. There are 7 chapters in this book. 4 of them, which is over half, numerically speaking, take place during the first 3 weeks of the text. So the last 3 chapters take place over 6 years and 49 months, or excuse me, 6 years and 49 weeks or so, 49 months. And yes, and also the number of pages. The first 4 chapters are about 200 pages, and the last 3 are something like 500 pages. And so you do see sort of a shift in this text. And though there are not officially 1 and 2 parts, when there is definitely a difference between the beginning of Hans Castorp's stay in the first 3 weeks and the remainder of his stay. You could, I think, certainly make that argument effectively. In any case, 1914 to 1919, during World War I, largely, Mann wrote through chapter 4, there we are, and the HIPA subchapter, that's the same HIPA, is the young boy that Hans Castorp shared a pencil with, whom Madame Chauchat reminds him of in a sort of romantic way, and was still close to 820 pages to go in the Low Porter edition. There are 2 famous English translations of The Magic Mountain. One is the so-called Low Porter. That's the first, older one, runs about 900 pages long. The one we have chosen for this, for our reading, is the so-called John Wood's translation, which is reduced to around 700, 750 pages. This should tell you a little bit about the nature of translation. How can it be that translating from German to English, and that's 900 pages with one translation and only 750 pages in another? Of course, correcting for font size and page size and things like that. It tells you something about word choice and syntax and the ability to relate to somebody or to relate to readers the ideas in very different words from those imagined by the author. Something I should mention is that though Thomas Mann obviously did know English and speak in English, was gifted in terms of his linguistic acquisition, he did write this text in his native German. So that's why we have the John A. Woods translation. That said, Thomas Mann returned to the Magic Mountain in 1919 after he leaves it aside for 4 years and works on Reflections of an Unpolitical Man. These are his reflections on the state of Germany and National Socialism. They will be, they're somewhat negative reflections on the direction that Germany is going. In 1919, after he returns to the Magic Mountain, he then finishes it 5 years later in 1924. Just like it took Joyce 7 years to write Ulysses, it takes several years for Mann to write this work. That is, to some extent, or you might hypothesize that to some extent, why texts like these feel like they have so much substance in them. It's because so much substance, time, energy, and skill has been put into them. These thinkers, like I hope you are such a thinker with your own writing, have given themselves time to mull over what they're thinking, and they have revisited their writing, edited and re-edited to make sure that it is perfect. They're truly artists. And I implore you, admonish you, exhort you to follow their example in that respect. In any case, this text has been argued to be political or unpolitical by many commentators. That's the Magic Mountain. But it shows a vision of Weimar Germany, which of course was 1918 to 1930 for a very short period in time. Mann was always a fervent opponent of National Socialism. Unlike many writers, like I mentioned earlier, Martin Heidegger, for example, Mann stayed on the right side of history. And because of his firm resistance in speech and writing, Thomas Mann's studies took time to get off the ground in German. Brief synopsis of Magic Mountain itself. the protagonist, and there truly is a protagonist for the Magic Mountain, unless you want to make some sort of argument that the Magic Mountain is itself a character, and rather than a setting, would be interesting, though difficult to make. Hans Castorp is our protagonist, our protos character, our first character. And interestingly, like we discussed on Monday, he's very, very different from Leopold Bloom, Molly Bloom, and from our Telemachus like Stephen Dedalus. Stephen Dedalus is a genius, very intelligent, has a religious education that he struggles with, is himself from a subjected people, the Irish under British rule, home rule at this time. Subjected not only by the British and their English language, but also by the Romans and the Roman Catholic religion and their language of Latin, too. All of this swimming around in his head. How is he going to come to himself and create the uncreated consciousness of this Irish people who no longer speaks Irish and no longer even has their former folk religion? It has this religion from Rome, is imposed upon, imperialized by two masters. Hans Castorp could not be more different from this. He comes from mighty Germany, which was itself struggling to be the great hegemon, the word from international relations theory, of the European landmass against what, in their minds, would have been the evil British. The British and the Germans, you should know, inherited the same mythology from Rome. They both tracked their foundings and to the Roman character Aeneas. In fact, Britain comes from one of Aeneas's children named Brutus itself. And so you may have heard that even the great leader of Britain, the mythological leader King Arthur, is himself hypothesized to have been a Roman legionnaire. And in fact, I think the most recent King Arthur movie that came out something like 10 or 15 years ago, he is in fact a Roman legionnaire. And so these are both countries that were very deeply influenced by the Aeneid and by Rome and by Greco-Roman culture, and came into conflict with each other, trying to be the dominant powers on their landmasses, with also Russia there always lurking next, which is a state in which Britain and Germany find themselves today in their own relations with Russia, who is very much not their ally, and they're not its ally. In any case, this young, mediocre, or rather this Hans Castorp, not only does he come from a very powerful country, he is himself a very mediocre guy. He's not very thoughtful. He takes a lot as it comes. He often has a drink of a beer at breakfast, and I want you to think about that. What do most people drink at breakfast? Coffee. What does coffee do for you? What is the drug in coffee? Caffeine. Does caffeine lower your mental level or increase it? Does it help you focus or hurt your focus? It helps your focus. The whole point is so that you can get through your work. Drinking beer, one doesn't drink beer to focus better. One generally drinks to take the edge off, to loosen up, as it were, to relax. So what does it mean that he drinks beer at breakfast? For how he conducts his days. And he's relaxed. His days, he kind of goes about in a stupor, smokes his cigars. These are cigars too. I don't know if any of you are smokers. I highly recommend against it. But a cigar is a far more potent way of taking in nicotine than a cigarette. You've seen the size of cigars, right? They're huge. You can get smaller ones, and you're not supposed to inhale them. It makes people very sick. But you're getting a lot of nicotine through the leaves in your mouth. You're absorbing it through your mouth. This is why mouth cancers can be big with cigar and pipe smokers, and also throat cancers. Very nasty stuff. That said, he kind of walks around during the course of his days, taking things as they are, in a slightly drunken, not drunk state, but in a very relaxed state. He is very different from Stephen, who is trying to find a home, trying to navigate his way through life, thinking very deep and difficult thoughts that are very meaningful to him, thinking also about the presence of death in his life through his own mother's recent demise. Stephen is a very present character. And it seems like when he drinks to escape the presence of his circumstances. Hans Castorp is a much more lukewarm character. It's a much more relaxed figure, although he will get into philosophical debates with Settembrini over time. During his time at the Berghof, he'll study many things. He'll study music and opera. He'll study anatomy. He'll even get into the occult and summon a spirit from the dead near the end. Somebody who is actually currently alive during the first few chapters, but will not be by that time. And so I want you to keep in mind the very many differences between Stephen Bloom and also Hans Castorp. Hans Castorp does not come from a minority group, as Bloom may, as a Jewish individual. He comes from very much the majority. He is himself something like a representation of bourgeois German man at this time. And even his job is somewhat typical. He has recently been an intern and is going to be an engineer who helps to build ships. I want you to keep this in mind. What is the name of the book that he brings with him to the Berghof? Does anybody remember? Ocean Steamships. What is the job that Joachim Simpson, his cousin, wishes to work? He wishes to join the military. What does this tell you about the place where Hans Castorp and Joachim Simpson live? The two young men. One is going into the military for a promising career. One is going to become an engineer who builds ships that can be used for transportation, but also for naval purposes. This tells you that these two men are part of a nation that is building up for war. Whenever you hear about a nation building up its industrial capacity, as Russia recently has, and Germany and England now have to, and the United States has sort of not, though in the last couple of weeks or so, there's been some suggestion that we will. We'll have to find out. It's hard to tell in real time what's actually happening in a country as big as ours. Sometimes things need to shake out a little bit, as it were. But something to keep in mind is that obviously these men and their career choices and have been shaped by the air around them and the social political situations that they find themselves in. War is in the air. There is a need for engineers to build up things like steamships and eventually to work on things like planes and machine guns and rockets, as well as effective ways to deploy poisonous gases. And so, though Hans Castorp is himself a sort of comfortable person who lives a comfortable life, you can see around him that the world is preparing for something very uncomfortable. And in fact, something you might think about him is that he must willfully keep himself unconscious of these facts. And perhaps this is why he ends up staying at the Berghof, that he rejects life, that he, like Settembrini, calls him his life's problem child. That though there are momentous events happening around him, and particularly involving the country of his own origin, that perhaps he wants to reject the winds of fate, as it were. He does not want to join in the fate of his fellow man. That said, by the end of the text, he will find himself on the battlefield in Flanders, Belgium. And so for all his attempts not to be moved by the winds of fate that draw his German brothers together into combat in World War I, he is eventually, in a sort of a Dostoevsky determinist way, finally drawn in. In any case, while at the sanatorium, the story is the story of an ordinary or mediocre, you could even write an entire essay on whether he's ordinary or mediocre, young man named Hans Castorp, who first visits his cousin Joachim Simpson for 3 weeks, but ends up staying for 7 years. While at the sanatorium, the soon-to-be engineer takes up the study of biology, music, and even the occult. He develops a love interest in a Russian woman who comes from the good Russian table. There's also a bad Russian table among the 7 tables at the Berghof for Claudia Shosha. Shosha itself comes from 2 French words. Any of you French students? Chaud, which has a D at the end, means hot, chat, like le chat noir, and you may have seen those posters. Black cat means cat, so black cat, or sorry, excuse me, hot cat. Shosha, hot cat is what her name means. And I told you also that this is the name of a machine gun that was in use during World War I. something interesting about this machine gun, if you wish to make connections between it and Metempsychosis. It was well loved by Americans, but it was so finically made that when it broke down, as they often did, it was not worth it to fix it. And so it would be used until it was used up. And then when it came time to fix the shosha, it would be thrown out, cast aside. Perhaps there's some sort of allegorical connection between the fact of the shosha machine gun and the fact of the character of Metempsychosis herself. In any case, we also meet an Italian rationalist progressive, he calls himself a humanist, named Ludovico Settembrini, that's Septim, like Septim 7, as I said, who calls him life's problem child, Hans. In fact, tries to convince Hans to rejoin the world on, I believe, the first full day he is there, and something after his fourth meal. So however many meals they have during the course of the day at the Berghof. They do have breakfast, second breakfast, they have tea after dinner. There's several meals as well as multiple rest periods as well. In fact, they live another coinage of Settembrini. They live in what's called the horizontal position. They're often lying on their backs, taking their rest cure. Oh yeah, there's another 7 for you too. When they take their temperatures, as the members of the Berghof or the occupants of the Berghof do, they take their temperature for 7 minutes. Anyways, Settembrini early on sees that there is something interesting about Hans Castorp, and like Director Behrens, who is one of the 2 practicing physicians on the mountain, Director Behrens, who himself seems to have some small version of tuberculosis with his protruding eyes and his purple cheeks, who lost a wife to this mountain earlier in his career and then stayed here, though he does have a young dashing son who will come visit. There's also a second doctor who is himself a psychoanalyst named Dr. Korkowski. Both of them are cosmopolitan. They speak several languages. They seem to both have a mastery of German, Russian, and whatever they need to speak to various other characters, almost certainly French as well. Something that Director Behrens said to Hans Castorp early on when he first meets him is that he would be a much better patient than his hasty and eager to leave cousin, Joachim Season. He says, I can always tell when somebody has merit as a patient, and I could tell that you would be a good one. In fact, Hans Castorp says this to Settembrini, and he tucks at him and says, he did say that to you, did he? Settembrini seems to be something like the Jiminy Cricket or the moral conscience of Hans Castorp, who seems to see through to the nature of him, that he is a relaxed individual, that if allowed to give in to physical and moral lassitude, certainly will. That perhaps Hans Castorp is the sort of person that, like many people during the COVID-19 closures, needs the structure of the world and the day around him in order to function well. Settembrini does not believe it would be good for Hans Castorp to spend any additional time in the Berghof, even the original 3 weeks. He says, why don't you just leave now on the second day? Don't get caught here. Perhaps that is part of the magic of the mountain. It is perhaps it is something like an enchanted wood or something like a gingerbread house that lures one in and then consumes one. In any case, the 2 positions of the mountains are, as said, Director Behrens, who is called Radamanthus, a nice mythical correlate by Settembrini, and Korkowski Minos. In the epic Virgil's Aeneid, these 2 brothers, King Minos, father of the Minotaur from Crete, is one of the judges of the dead who sends souls to the Elysian fields, and Radamanthus, and I may be inverting these, is the soul, or is the brother that sends the souls to the hell sort of area, the dis area, as it were. In any case, these are the 2 judges of the dead in the Greco-Roman underworld that choose whether somebody goes to heaven, which is heaven in this case leaving from this mountain, or to hell. Is hell staying at the mountain, which is itself elevated, like in Olympus, or is the mountain hell? Settembrini calls the denizens there shades. So there's a suggestion that all those who are riddled with tuberculosis, and many of whom are doomed to die, that even those who are not doomed to die while they are at the Berg Hall are in the underworld and are themselves shapes, as if being in a hospital like that is like being on Calypso's island in the Odyssey. It is sort of a life that is not life. Where even though time passes, it seems not to pass. And this is also physically true in the space of the Berg Hall, because even during the summer, the top of the mountain is covered in snow. So it's like time is never, ever passing. And so Sudden Breeding makes the claim that this is a place for the dead who are living, who do not belong here. In any case, I've stayed 1 minute too long, as I now note, and I owe you 3 minutes, and we will have to talk more about this the next time we